The crimson lounge breathed in secrets and exhaled stale smoke. It was a place of careful neutrality, a lung of bruised velvet and dark wood wedged between the territories of warring immortals, where blood feuds were meant to be left at the door like wet coats. Tonight, the air was different. It was thin and sharp, carrying the metallic tang of anticipation. Every shadow seemed to hold its breath. Dante Moretti felt the tension the moment he stepped across the threshold, a low hum against his senses, as palpable as the bass thrumming from the hidden speakers. He wore the weight of his crown not as a burden, but as a mantle of absolute stillness. To any mortal eye, he was simply a man of severe, arresting beauty, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to drink the already dim light. But to the 8 men scattered strategically throughout the room, he was a target. A king who had foolishly walked into a cage. He knew they were here. He had known before his driver had even pulled the car to the curb. The Volkov clan, for all their brutish ambition, were creatures of predictable habit. This attempt on his life was not a matter of if, but when. His new treaty, the one that forbade bloodshed on neutral ground, was a chain he had forged for his enemies as much as for himself. He wanted to see how hard they would pull on it. His gaze swept the room, cataloguing threats with an unnerving placidity. 2 at the bar, pretending to be absorbed in their drinks. 3 in a booth near the back, their laughter a brittle thing. 1 by the jukebox, his posture too rigid for a man appreciating old music. And 2 more near the entrance, a clumsy attempt to block his only escape. They were nervous, their anxiety a sour scent on the air. They were hunters who knew, deep in their bones, that their chosen prey was the true predator. Dante moved toward the bar, his steps unhurried, a deliberate and sovereign progress through a room thick with imminent violence. He ignored the men who tracked his every move and focused instead on the one person who seemed oblivious to the coiled serpent in their midst, the bartender. She moved with an economy of motion that was its own kind of grace. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, a few stray strands clinging to her temples. She wasn't classically beautiful, not in the way of the ageless women who moved through his court. Her face was a study in sharp angles and quiet intelligence, her eyes dark and observant as she polished a glass, her focus absolute. She looked tired, the way humans did when they worked too long for too little, but there was a resilience in the set of her shoulders, a strength in her slender hands. He took a seat at the far end of the bar, the spot that gave him a clear view of the entire room. The 2 Volkov assassins beside him stiffened, their cheap cologne a sudden, cloying assault. Dante ignored them. He watched the woman. She finished her task, set the glass down, and finally looked his way. Her eyes met his, and for a fractional moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. There was no flicker of recognition, no fear. Just the flat, professional appraisal of a bartender sizing up a new customer. "What can I get you?" Her voice was low, with a slightly rough edge, like smooth river stones scraping together. "Something old," Dante said, his own voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the ambient noise. She nodded once, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She turned, her movements fluid, and reached for a bottle on the top shelf, its amber contents the color of distilled twilight. As her back was turned, her shoulders tensed. It was a minute thing, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles beneath her simple black shirt, but to Dante, it was as loud as a scream. She had seen it. She had felt the wrongness in the room. Her eyes, when she turned back, were no longer flat. They were sharp, darting from the men in the booth to the sentinels at the door, then back to him. She saw him not as a customer, but as the epicenter of the coming storm. She poured his drink, her hand perfectly steady, the stream of scotch a silent, golden waterfall into the heavy crystal glass. She slid it across the polished wood toward him. Tucked beneath the base of the glass was a small, folded cocktail napkin. Dante's fingers closed around the cool glass. He did not immediately look at the napkin. He held her gaze. He saw the conflict there, the war between self-preservation and a stubborn, inexplicable flicker of conscience. She was afraid. He could smell it on her, a faint scent like ozone and rain. But she had acted anyway. Slowly, he lifted the glass and brought it to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. He took a sip, the peat and smoke a familiar comfort on his tongue. Then, with deliberate slowness, he set the glass down and picked up the napkin. He unfolded it beneath the lip of the bar, shielding it from view. The handwriting was clean, precise, and urgent. Block letters scrawled in blue ink. "You're in danger. Back exit. Now." He read the words twice. A warning. From a human who owed him nothing, who knew nothing of him. A mortal woman who had looked at a room full of predators and chosen to help the one they were surrounding. It was the most reckless, pointless, and profoundly brave thing he had witnessed in a century. A strange warmth, an emotion so ancient he had nearly forgotten its name, unfurled in the cold stasis of his chest. Amusement. Admiration. He lifted his gaze from the napkin and met her worried eyes. He allowed the corner of his mouth to lift in a dark, slow smile, a sight that was both terrifying and utterly mesmerizing. He held the napkin between two fingers, a silent acknowledgement of her gesture. "So are they," he murmured, the words meant for her alone, a promise whispered into the heart of the storm. And then he moved. Time seemed to stretch, to dilate around him. The first man, the one to his left, was reaching inside his jacket. Dante's hand shot out, not in a punch, but with an open palm, striking the man's sternum. It was not a blow meant to break bone, but to steal breath. The man's lungs seized, his eyes wide with shock as he folded silently, a puppet with its strings cut. The second man at the bar was faster, a knife already in his hand, arcing toward Dante's side. Dante didn't even seem to look. His other hand came up, catching the man's wrist in a grip of iron. There was a sound, a sickening crack of bone, and the knife clattered to the floor. The man crumpled with a choked cry. 2 down. 6 to go. The room erupted. The brittle laughter in the booth shattered into shouts. The 3 men there scrambled to their feet, but they were clumsy, caught off guard by the impossible speed of it all. Dante was already moving, a blur of dark motion. He used the bar stool as a weapon, a single, fluid motion sending it spinning into the legs of the first man, who went down in a tangle of limbs. The second lunged, and Dante met him, his body a fulcrum of controlled violence. He sidestepped the clumsy punch, his hand clamping onto the back of the man's neck, and used his momentum to slam his face into the heavy oak of a nearby table. The sound was a wet, final thud. The third hesitated, a fatal error. Dante closed the distance in a single heartbeat, his fingers finding the pressure points on the man's shoulders. The man's arms went limp, his body slumping as his entire nervous system was momentarily, brutally overloaded. 5 down. 3 to go. Myra stood frozen behind the bar, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were white. Her mind couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. It wasn't a fight. It was a disassembly. A methodical, terrifyingly silent dismantling of 8 large, armed men by one. The man by the jukebox finally drew his weapon, a glint of silver in the dim light. He never had a chance to aim. A heavy glass ashtray from a nearby table flew through the air, thrown with impossible force and accuracy, and shattered against his temple. He dropped like a stone. 6 down. 2 left. The 2 at the door, the clumsy sentinels, finally reacted. They were torn between their duty and the primal instinct to flee. They chose duty. It was the wrong choice. Dante turned to face them, his suit immaculate, not a single hair out of place. He looked calm, almost bored, as if he were merely clearing away a minor inconvenience. He walked toward them, his steps measured and inexorable. They came at him together, a pincer movement that might have worked on a mortal man. On Dante, it was an invitation. He ducked under the first wild swing, his hand snaking out to grab the man's ankle. He pulled, and the man went down hard, his head connecting with the floor with a hollow crack. The last man standing stared, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He saw not a man, but an impossibility. A force of nature in a tailored suit. He turned to run. Dante was there before the man's foot had completed its first step. He didn't strike him. He simply placed a hand on his chest. A current, a silent, invisible shock, passed from Dante's palm into the man. The assassin's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the crimson lounge. The low thrum of the music seemed to have vanished. The only sounds were the ragged, shocked breaths of the few other patrons cowering in the corners, and the soft, rhythmic drip of scotch from an overturned bottle. 8 bodies lay scattered across the floor, groaning, twitching, or utterly still. Not one of them was dead. Broken, bruised, and comprehensively defeated, but alive. The treaty held. Dante stood in the center of the carnage, a still point in a world he had just violently reordered. He smoothed the front of his jacket, a gesture of casual finality. Then, he turned and his eyes found Myra's. She was still clutching the bar, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was slowly being replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He was not just a man. He was something else. Something ancient and dangerous and utterly beyond her comprehension. He had not fought. He had reigned. He walked back to the bar, his shoes making no sound on the scuffed floorboards. He stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick roll of bills, and placed it on the bar. It was far more than enough to cover the drink, the damage, the chaos. For the inconvenience, he said, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. He turned to leave, his purpose here fulfilled. But he stopped. He looked back at her, at the small, brave human who had tried to warn the storm of its own coming. "Thank you," he said. And the words, spoken with a sincerity that cut through the cold aura of his power, were more stunning than the violence that had preceded them. He held her gaze for one last, long moment, a silent promise hanging in the air between them. Then he was gone, melting back into the night, leaving Myra alone in the wreckage, with a pile of money, 8 unconscious assassins, and the chilling memory of his dark, grateful smile. The next night, he returned. The bar had been scrubbed clean of the previous evening's chaos, but the memory of it lingered, a ghost in the scent of bleach and polish. The regular patrons were absent, replaced by a nervous quiet. Myra was there, her movements a little tighter, her eyes scanning the door with an anxious energy she couldn't quite conceal. When Dante walked in, a collective breath was held. He ignored the whispers and the wide-eyed stares, taking the same seat at the end of the bar. Myra approached him, her expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. She placed a clean napkin in front of him, her hands not quite steady. "The same?" she asked, her voice a little strained. "Please," Dante replied. She turned to get the bottle, her back to him. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a fine-tuned wire of fear and curiosity. He had expected her to be gone. He would not have blamed her. Most humans, after witnessing what she had, would have run and never looked back. But she was still here. Still working. Still facing him. She placed the drink before him. "That was a lot of money," she said, her gaze fixed on the glass, not on him. "You overpaid." "I paid for what the evening was worth," he said softly. "Information." And a moment of unexpected courage. Her head snapped up at that, her dark eyes finally meeting his. The fear was still there, but it was underpinned by a flicker of defiance. "I would have done it for anyone." "I know," he said, and the simple affirmation seemed to surprise her. "That is what makes it noteworthy." He drank his scotch in silence, and she went about her work, wiping down the counter, restocking glasses, pretending he was just another customer. But a connection had been forged in the violence of the night before, an invisible thread that now stretched between them. He watched her, the way she interacted with the few brave souls who had ventured in. She was efficient, observant, missing nothing. She had a quiet authority that required no raised voice, no overt threats. People simply did as she asked. She was a woman accustomed to handling trouble, though likely nothing on the scale he had brought to her doorstep. He came back the next night. And the night after that. It became a ritual. He would arrive just after the evening rush, when the bar was sinking into its late-night lull. He would take his seat, she would pour his drink without asking, and they would exist in a shared space of quiet observation. Sometimes they spoke. He would ask her about the city, about the bar, about the small, mundane details of a human life he had not experienced in centuries. He learned her name was Myra Chen. She had owned the bar for 3 years, having inherited it from her father. She worked punishing hours, her life a cycle of opening doors, wiping counters, and closing up long after the city had gone to sleep. In return, she asked nothing of him. She never questioned who he was, or what he had done. She never mentioned the 8 broken men. It was an unspoken pact of silence. Yet, she treated him not with the deference or terror his kind expected, but with a startling, almost unnerving, normalcy. She would chide him if he left a ring of condensation on the bar. She would cut him off from conversation if she got busy. She treated him like a regular, and for Dante, who had not been treated as anything less than a monarch for 500 years, it was a profound and unsettling relief. One evening, about a week after the incident, a man from his security detail, a stern, ancient vampire named Marcus, entered the bar. Marcus's presence immediately dropped the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. He approached Dante with a stiff bow, his eyes flicking disdainfully toward Myra. "My lord," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. "There is a matter requiring your attention." Dante saw Myra's eyes widen slightly at the title. "Lord." The word hung in the air, heavy and definitive. She looked from Marcus's severe, predatory face to Dante's calm one, and a piece of the puzzle clicked into place for her. Royalty. Of some kind. It explained the suit, the bearing, the casual, terrifying violence. Dante waved a dismissive hand at his guard. "It can wait, Marcus." "But, my lord," the Volkov emissary. "Can wait," Dante repeated, his voice dropping an octave, laced with an authority that made the ancient vampire flinch. "I am otherwise occupied." Marcus bowed again, lower this time, and retreated to a dark corner to wait, his disapproval a palpable force. When he was gone, Myra busied herself polishing the same glass for the 3rd time. "Lord," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. Dante watched her. "A formality." "Doesn't sound like one," she countered, still not looking at him. "Your friend looks like he wants to rip my throat out for breathing your air." A faint smile touched Dante's lips. "Marcus is overly protective. He has served my family for a very long time." "Your family," she repeated. "You're some kind of mob boss, aren't you? Is that it?" "Moretti." Sounds Italian. The guess was so mortal, so wonderfully, beautifully mundane, that Dante almost laughed. It was better than the truth. Safer. But he found he did not want to lie to her. "Something like that," he allowed. "My family is old. With many rivals." "The Volkovs," she stated, not a question. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. "The men from the other night." "Yes." She absorbed this, her expression unreadable. She put down her cloth and leaned against the back counter, crossing her arms. "So you're not just a guy who likes old scotch. You're a target. And you keep coming back to the place you were targeted." She shook her head. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "I am neither," Dante said, his voice low and serious. "I am making a point. To the Volkovs, this bar is now my territory. They will not dare to try again here. This place, and everyone in it, is safe because I am here." His eyes held hers, and she understood the unspoken message. "You are safe. I will keep you safe." It was a promise, and a claim. Myra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was a bartender. He was a king of some dark, violent world. And he had just drawn a circle around her, declaring her under his protection. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a strange, unwelcome flutter of security. She had spent her whole life being fiercely independent, relying on no one. To suddenly be the focus of such absolute, predatory protection was a dizzying, terrifying, and strangely comforting sensation. "I can take care of myself," she said, the words a reflexive defense. "I have no doubt," Dante replied, taking a slow sip of his drink. "But you are no longer the only one who wishes to do so." The treaty was a fragile thing, a dam holding back a century of bad blood. While Dante's presence kept the Crimson Lounge sacrosanct, Myra's life outside its walls was another matter entirely. The Volkovs were not known for their subtlety or their honor. An attack on neutral ground had failed, a message sent by other means would be their next move. Dante knew this. He had his security monitoring her, shadows watching shadows, but he could not be everywhere. The attack came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after their first meeting. It was late, after midnight, and Myra was walking the 4 blocks from the bar to her small apartment above a closed-down bakery. The street was quiet, slick with a fine mist that haloed the orange glow of the streetlights. She was tired, her mind already on the comfort of her bed. That was why she didn't notice the van parked halfway down the block, its engine off, its windows dark. She didn't hear them until it was too late. They were fast, moving with the unnatural silence of their kind. One moment she was alone on the pavement, the next, 2 figures materialized from the mouth of an alley. They were not the clumsy thugs from the bar. These were professionals. Their eyes held the flat, dead light of true predators. Myra's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Her hand went instinctively to the can of pepper spray on her keychain, a pathetic defense against the things that now stood before her. Myra Chen, the taller one said, his voice a sibilant hiss. He smiled, showing teeth that were just a little too sharp. Lord Moretti's pet. Ivan Volkov sends his regards. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. Her fear was a cold, solid thing in her gut, but on its surface floated the hard ice of defiance. She backed away slowly, her keys clutched in her hand, the small metal teeth facing outward. I don't know any Moretti, she lied, her voice shaking only slightly. The second one laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Don't you? He seems to know you. Sits in your bar every night like a lovesick boy. The great Dante Moretti, brought to heel by a little human bartender. Ivan finds it insulting. They moved to flank her, cutting off her retreat. The street was empty, a desolate urban canyon. No one was coming to help. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She braced herself, ready to fight, to go down swinging, because it was the only thing she knew how to do. And then, he was there. It wasn't an arrival so much as a manifestation. One moment, the space behind the 2 Volkov assassins was empty, filled only with mist and streetlight. The next, Dante was standing there, a figure of absolute wrath carved from the night itself. He hadn't made a sound. He had simply appeared, as if the shadows had coalesced to form him. The change in him was profound. In the bar, he was a king in repose, his power a coiled thing held in careful check. Here, on a dark street with Myra's life on the line, the leash was off. His eyes were not the dark, intelligent eyes she knew. They were pits of black fire, burning with an ancient, possessive fury. The air crackled around him, thick with menace. The 2 Volkovs froze, their predatory confidence evaporating into raw, primal fear. They turned slowly, their faces paling to a sickly white. Moretti, the first one stammered, his bravado gone. Dante didn't speak. He took a single step forward, and the pavement seemed to tremble. The temperature plummeted. He was no longer a man in a suit. He was a nightmare given form. He moved, and it was the same impossible speed she had seen in the bar, but this time it was not controlled. It was unleashed. He reached the first vampire before the creature could even raise its hands. Dante's hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip. His fingers closed around the vampire's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The sound of choking, of cartilage and bone giving way, was horrific. Dante held him there for a long, terrible moment, his eyes burning into the vampire's, before flinging him aside like a broken doll. The body hit the side of the brick building with a sickening crunch and slid to the ground, unmoving. The second vampire, paralyzed by terror, finally broke and ran. He didn't get 5 feet. Dante was a blur, a streak of darkness that intersected the vampire's path. Myra saw a flash of movement, an arm swinging in a brutal arc. She heard a sound like a great tree branch snapping in a storm. The vampire screamed, a high, piercing shriek of agony that was cut short as Dante's other hand slammed into his chest, sending him flying backward to land in a crumpled heap near his partner. Silence returned to the street, heavier and more profound than before. It was broken only by Myra's ragged breathing and the soft, wet groans of the 2 broken things on the pavement. Dante stood over them, his chest rising and falling slowly. The inferno in his eyes banked, receding, but the cold fury remained. He looked at the 2 vampires, his expression one of utter contempt. He had not killed them. The treaty, even its spirit, was something he adhered to with rigid self-control, but he had left them shattered, a message written in broken bones and terror that would be delivered back to Ivan Volkov with perfect clarity. Then, he turned to Myra. She was pressed against the cold brick wall of the bakery, her eyes wide, her whole body trembling. She wasn't looking at the broken vampires. She was looking at him. At the monster who had just saved her. The last vestiges of her denial crumbled into dust. Mob boss. Royalty. These were human words for human things. This was something else entirely. Ancient. Inhuman. A predator of the highest order. He took a step toward her, his expression softening from fury to a deep, aching concern. He saw her flinch, a small, involuntary recoil, and it stopped him cold. The look on his face was more devastating than his anger had been. It was a look of profound hurt, the expression of a man who had just revealed his most terrifying secret and been met with the revulsion he had always expected. "Myra," he said, his voice raw. She stared at him, at the face that was both familiar and now utterly alien. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Fear was a physical thing, a cold liquid flooding her veins. But beneath the fear, that stubborn, irrational core of her remained. He hadn't hurt her. He had saved her. He had unleashed that terrifying power for her. Slowly, fighting against every instinct for survival that screamed at her to run, she pushed herself off the wall. She took a shaky step toward him. Then another. She stopped just a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling not just from fear, but from the cold and the shock. "What are you?" she whispered, the words barely audible in the misty air. Dante's jaw tightened. He looked away for a moment, at the dark, empty street, as if gathering the strength to say the word. When his eyes returned to hers, they were filled with a weary resignation, the sorrow of a creature long accustomed to being a monster in the eyes of others. "I am a vampire," he said. The word fell between them, simple, damning, and irrefutable. It explained everything. The speed, the strength, the stillness, the ancient authority in his eyes. It was an admission that should have sent her screaming into the night. Myra just stood there, her mind reeling, trying to reconcile the quiet, thoughtful man who drank scotch at her bar with the terrifying creature of wrath who had just dismantled two of his own kind. The two images warred in her mind. The monster, and the protector. "You're hurt," he said, his gaze dropping to her arm, where a long, shallow scratch from one of the vampire's rings had drawn a thin line of blood. Before she could react, he was in front of her, his hand gently taking her arm. His touch was cool but not cold, his grip surprisingly gentle. He examined the cut, his expression grim. "Their rings are often laced with anticoagulants. It will not heal quickly." She looked down at her arm, then back up at his face, so close now. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the faint lines of exhaustion around them that spoke of centuries of vigilance. The monster was gone. In his place was the man from the bar, his concern for her overriding everything else. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They will send others." He began to lead her away from the scene, his hand a firm, protective presence on her arm. "Wait," a voice rasped from the alley. Dante froze, spinning to place himself between Myra and the sound. It was one of the Volkovs, the one whose throat he had crushed. He was trying to pull himself up, his face a mask of agony and hate. "She will not be safe with you, Moretti," the vampire choked out, spitting a mouthful of dark blood onto the pavement. "We will find her. We will make her forget you. We will make her forget everything." Dante's eyes narrowed. It was a common threat, and a potent one. Vampire compulsion. The ability to wipe and rewrite a human mind, to turn a witness into a friend, an enemy into a puppet. It was a power the Volkovs used with cruel abandon. For a moment, Dante considered going back and finishing the job, treaty be damned. But then he felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down. It was Myra. She was looking at the broken vampire with an expression not of fear, but of cold, clear-eyed focus. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady now, the tremor gone. "He's not worth your time." Dante searched her face, seeing the shock giving way to a hard-won resolve. He gave a final, dismissive glance at the broken creature in the alley and then guided Myra down the street, away from the violence and into the uncertain future that had just opened up before them. He took her not to her apartment, but to his car, which had materialized at the end of the block as silently as he had. The door was opened by Marcus, whose stone-faced expression flickered with surprise at seeing the human woman at his master's side. Inside the car, the silence was thick. The vehicle moved with impossible smoothness through the sleeping city. Myra stared out the window, watching the streetlights slide by, her mind a whirlwind. Vampire. The word echoed, refusing to be dismissed. I should take you somewhere safe, Dante said, breaking the silence. A place the Volkovs can't reach. And then what? Myra asked, her voice flat. She turned from the window to face him. You wipe my memory? Make me forget tonight? Make me forget you? She echoed the threat from the alley, her eyes challenging him. Dante's expression was pained. It would be the safest course of action. For you. You think I'm safer not knowing that things like you and them exist? That I'm safer being blind, she shot back, a spark of her usual fire returning. I don't. Myra, you don't understand the power of compulsion. It is absolute. They could turn you against me. They could make you walk into a trap. Forgetting is a mercy. Show me, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Dante stared at her. What? Show me. This compulsion, she insisted. Do it. Make me forget the last hour. Make me believe I slipped and fell and scraped my arm. If it's for my own good, then do it. It was a test. A challenge born of terror and a desperate need to understand the new rules of her world. Dante hesitated. The thought of violating her mind, even for her own protection, was abhorrent to him. But he saw the resolve in her eyes. She would not let it go. And perhaps it was better that she see the truth of it from him, rather than from an enemy. All right, he said reluctantly. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, melodic cadence. His eyes held hers, and she felt a strange, soporific pressure begin to build behind her own. It was a gentle, insistent pushing, like a tide rising against the walls of her mind. You are going to relax, Dante murmured, his voice weaving a tapestry of command. Tonight was uneventful. You closed the bar, you walked home. You slipped on the wet pavement. That is how you cut your arm. The men in the alley were a dream. I am just a customer who offered you a ride. You will remember none of this. You will forget. He watched her pupils, expecting them to dilate, for her expression to go slack as her mind yielded to his will. He pushed harder, the full force of his ancient power, a will that could sway armies and topple dynasties, focusing on this one small, stubborn human mind. Nothing happened. Myra blinked. The pressure in her head vanished. She looked at him, her expression unchanged, her memory perfectly intact. Is that it? She asked, a note of genuine confusion in her voice. It felt like a headache starting. And then it went away. Dante pulled back as if he'd been burned. He stared at her, his mind, for the first time in centuries, utterly and completely stunned into silence. It was impossible. No human could resist a direct compulsion from a vampire of his age and power. None. He reached out, his fingers gently touching her temple, as if searching for some physical sign of what had just happened. How, he whispered, the question not truly directed at her. Marcus, sitting in the front seat, had turned to watch the exchange, his own disbelief clear on his face. My lord. She is immune, Dante said, the words full of a dawning wonder. He looked at Myra, truly looked at her, and saw her not just as a brave woman, but as an anomaly. A miracle. Her courage, her lack of reflexive fear in his presence, her refusal to be intimidated, it wasn't just strength of character. It was a fundamental aspect of her nature. She was shielded from the greatest weapon his kind possessed. Immune. Myra repeated, the word foreign. What does that mean? It means, Dante said, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, that you are far more remarkable than I ever imagined. The discovery of Myra's immunity changed everything. It elevated her from a human Dante felt compelled to protect into something infinitely more valuable, an unknown quantity in a world governed by ancient, predictable rules. In his world, information was power, and the ability to control minds was the ultimate currency. Myra was a vault no one else could open. Dante brought her not to a safe house, but to the heart of his domain, a sprawling, Gothic estate hidden from the city by acres of old-growth forest and layers of security, both mortal and mystical. It was a place of stone and shadow, a fortress that had stood for centuries. To bring a human here, one not enthralled or indentured, was unprecedented. The moment she stepped across the threshold, she became the subject of intense, whispered curiosity among the household staff and Dante's inner circle of vampire retainers. He led her to a vast library, its walls lined with books from floor to ceiling, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting a warm, flickering light on their faces. "There are legends," Dante began, his voice thoughtful as he paced before the fire. "Ancient texts speak of certain human bloodlines, rare and scattered, that carry a natural resistance to our gifts. We always dismissed them as myth, a human fantasy of being able to defy us." He stopped and turned to her. "You are not a myth." Myra sank into a deep leather armchair that seemed to swallow her whole. She was still processing the whiplash of the evening, the attack, the revelation, the failed compulsion. "My family is from a small village in Guangzhou province. We're not special. We're just people. My parents ran a restaurant. I run a bar. Greatness often hides in the mundane," Dante countered. "Your ancestors may never have known what they carried in their veins. It might have lain dormant for generations, waiting for a moment like this." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "This immunity makes you a target of a different kind, Myra. The Volkovs, if they learn of it, will not want to kill you. They will want to possess you, to study you, to learn how to replicate your resistance, or to destroy it." A new kind of fear, colder and more intellectual, settled over her. It was one thing to be a target for revenge. It was another to be a specimen. "But it also makes you uniquely valuable," he continued, his voice dropping. "To me." He explained the delicate political balance he was trying to maintain. The treaty was his attempt to pull his kind out of the shadows, to forge a new way of existence that didn't rely on endless, bloody clan warfare. The Volkovs and other traditionalist factions resisted him at every turn, using espionage, betrayal, and mental manipulation as their primary weapons. "My entire court, my security, they can all be compelled," Dante explained, the weight of his kingship evident in his voice. "I trust them, but their minds are vulnerable. A trusted guard can be turned into an assassin with a single glance from a rival. A strategist can have their plans plucked from their head. I live in a fortress of secrets, and every one of my subjects is a potential unlocked door." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "Except you." The implication hung in the air between them. Myra felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Just hours ago, her biggest concern had been making rent and keeping the bar stocked. Now, a vampire king was telling her she was the key to his entire operation. "What are you asking?" she said, her voice quiet. "I am asking for your help," Dante said simply. "I need someone I can trust absolutely. Someone whose counsel is their own, whose observations are untainted. Your instincts, your bravery. I saw it that first night. You see things others miss. You see the human angle, the small details that my kind, in our arrogance and age, often overlook." He took a breath. "I want you to be my advisor." Myra stared at him, speechless. A bartender. An advisor to a king of vampires. The idea was so absurd it bordered on hysterical. "I don't know anything about your world. About treaties and clans and compulsion. I can teach you about my world," he countered. "But you can teach me about yours. You can be my eyes and ears, my anchor to the world I am trying to build a bridge to. I don't need another ancient vampire whispering the same old advice in my ear. I need a new perspective. I need yours." It was a preposterous, terrifying, and undeniably compelling offer. Her life as she knew it was over. The Volkovs had seen to that. She could try to run, to disappear, but they would find her. Or, she could step into the heart of the storm, stand beside the one person who could protect her, and fight back. She looked at Dante, at the earnest plea in the eyes of this ancient, powerful being, and she saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. He was a king surrounded by subjects, yet utterly alone in his mind. She had always been a fighter. She had fought to keep the bar afloat, fought to make a life for herself. This was just a different kind of fight. "Okay," she breathed, the word feeling impossibly small and yet monumentally heavy. "I'll do it." A visible wave of relief washed over Dante's features. The tension in his shoulders eased. He had offered her a position, but he had been asking for an ally. And she had said yes. Myra's transition from bartender to royal advisor was jarring. She moved into a suite of rooms in the estate that were larger than her entire apartment. She traded her jeans and t-shirts for the more formal attire required in Dante's court. But the most significant change was her presence in the command center of the Moretti clan, the war room. It was a stark, modern space hidden in the oldest part of the keep, a stark contrast of ancient stone walls and cutting-edge technology. Maps of the city glowed on holographic displays, and streams of data scrolled across massive screens. Here, Dante and his inner circle, Marcus, the stoic head of security, an ancient, calculating strategist named Elena, and a handful of other vampire nobles, planned their every move. At first, Myra's presence was met with suspicion and barely veiled hostility. They saw her as Dante's pet, a human distraction. She said little in the early meetings, content to listen, to observe, to learn the intricate dance of power and paranoia that defined their existence. She learned the names of their enemies, the locations of their safe houses, the weaknesses in their alliances. She absorbed it all with the same quiet intensity she had once used to monitor her bar. Her breakthrough came during a meeting about a suspected traitor. A recent shipment of silver-laced weaponry, vital for defense against werewolves, their other great rivals, had been ambushed. The leak had to have come from within. Elena had narrowed the suspects down to 3 high-ranking guards, all of whom had been with the Moretti clan for over a century. "We question them," Marcus insisted, his fist clenched. "We compel them. The truth will be forced out." "Compulsion can be resisted by a strong will, if only for a short time," Elena countered coolly. "And a forced confession is unreliable. The traitor may have been compelled himself by a Volkov agent, his mind wiped of the act. We could be punishing a victim." The debate raged, a circular argument of ancient vampire logic. Dante listened, his expression grim, his gaze distant. Finally, he looked to Myra, who had been silent throughout. "Myra, you have an opinion?" Every head in the room turned to her. The weight of their collective age and power was immense. She felt a flicker of her old fear, but pushed it down. She had a place at this table for a reason. "You're thinking about it like a vampire," she said, her voice clear and steady. The statement was a criticism, and several of the vampires stiffened. "You're focused on mind control and ancient loyalties. But the traitor is probably motivated by something much simpler. Something human." "And what would that be?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Greed," Myra said simply. "Or desperation. You've been checking their official clan stipends, their declared assets. You haven't been checking their gambling debts. Or if they have a sick human relative who needs expensive medical care. You're looking for a grand betrayal of ideology. I think you should be looking for a man with a problem that only money can solve." She pointed to a screen displaying financial data. "Cross-reference their known associates with hospital admissions, with activity at the city's underground casinos. Don't look at their minds. Look at their lives." There was a stunned silence in the room. It was such a simple, pragmatic approach, so rooted in the messy realities of the modern world, that none of them had even considered it. They were ancient creatures who thought in terms of honor, blood, and psychic warfare. They had forgotten the grubby, powerful motivations of simple cash. Dante stared at her, a slow look of profound respect dawning on his face. He turned to his tech analyst. "Do it," he commanded. "Do what she said." Within an hour, they had their man. One of the guards, a vampire named Lucian, had a human great-granddaughter dying of a rare genetic disorder. The experimental treatment cost a fortune. His clan stipend couldn't cover it. Financial records showed a series of large, anonymous payments into his account, originating from a shell corporation tied to the Volkovs. The ambush location had been exchanged for his great-granddaughter's life. When confronted, Lucian confessed immediately, not under compulsion, but with the weary relief of a man crushed by his choices. The case was closed. After that, the attitude toward Myra shifted. The suspicion was replaced by a grudging respect. They began to seek out her opinion, to see her not as a pet, but as a genuine asset. She had a way of cutting through their centuries of ingrained thinking, of seeing the simple, elegant solution they had missed. Her relationship with Dante deepened in tandem with her new role. They spent long hours together, not just in the war room, but in the library, in the gardens at dusk. He taught her the history of his people, the complex laws and traditions that governed them. She, in turn, told him about her life, about movies and music and the simple joy of a sunny day, things he had long since forgotten or never known. He found himself captivated by her perspective. She was unimpressed by his power, unfazed by his age. She saw the man beneath the king, the weary soul responsible for the lives of thousands. She challenged him, argued with him, and occasionally, she made him laugh, a real, genuine laugh that echoed strangely in the ancient halls, a sound his staff had not heard in decades. One night, they were standing on a balcony overlooking the sleeping estate. The moon was a silver coin in the black velvet sky. "You are never afraid," he observed quietly. "Not anymore. I'm terrified all the time," she confessed, her voice soft. She hugged her arms against the night chill. "But I've learned there's a difference between being scared and letting fear make your decisions for you. My whole life, I've had to be brave because I had no other choice. This is no different." She turned to look at him. "And it's easier to be brave when you're not standing alone." He stepped closer, his presence a shield against the cold. The space between them crackled with an energy that had been building for weeks, a tension that had nothing to do with strategy or war. It was something more personal, more profound. "You have never been alone, Myra," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Not since the moment you chose to slide that napkin across the bar." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. She leaned into his hand, a gesture of trust that was absolute. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not the hungry, possessive act of a predator. It was tentative, searching, full of a longing that spanned centuries. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of a deep and abiding connection that transcended the boundaries of their two worlds. It was the meeting of two lonely souls who had found their equal in the most unlikely of places. In that moment, she was not his advisor, and he was not her king. They were simply Dante and Myra, two people who had found a home in each other's unlikely company. The war with the Volkovs was far from over, but on that balcony, under the silent watch of the moon, they had won a quiet, personal victory that mattered more than any battle. The fragile peace was shattered by a calculated act of terror. Ivan Volkov, enraged by Dante's growing influence and the humiliating failure of his assassins, decided to escalate. He couldn't attack Dante's fortress directly, and he couldn't touch Myra while she was within its walls. So he struck at the only thing she had left in the outside world, her bar. The Crimson Lounge was firebombed in the dead of night. It was a brutal, symbolic act. The place where Dante and Myra had met, the place Dante had declared his own, was reduced to a blackened, smoldering shell. The news reached the estate just before dawn. Myra saw the images on a security feed, the roaring flames, the shattered windows, the twisted metal sign lying in the street. A wave of sickness and grief washed over her. It was just a building, just wood and brick and glass, but it had been hers. It had been her father's. It was the last piece of her old life, and now it was gone. Dante found her in the command center, staring at the looping footage, her face pale and her hands clenched into fists. His own fury was a cold, silent thing, a glacier of rage moving inexorably toward a single purpose. But when he saw the look on her face, the raw pain in her eyes, his anger was eclipsed by a fierce, protective ache. "I am sorry, Myra," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is my fault. He did this to hurt you, because of me. He did it to hurt you, she corrected, her voice tight. She finally tore her gaze from the screen to look at him. The grief was still there, but beneath it, a hard, cold anger was beginning to form. He's trying to provoke you. He wants you to break the treaty, to retaliate with open bloodshed so he can paint you as the aggressor to the other clans. He wants a war. Dante nodded grimly. And I am tempted to give him one. No, Myra said, her voice sharp. That's what he wants. We can't let him win that way. We have to be smarter. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pushing her personal grief aside, her mind already shifting back into the strategic mode he had come to rely on. This isn't just an attack. It's a statement. He's telling you he can still reach you, that nothing you value is safe. He's testing your control. Her insight, even in her own moment of loss, was staggering. She saw the political chessboard with a clarity that even Elena, his centuries-old strategist, sometimes lacked. She understood his goals, peace through strength, order through law, and she would not let him abandon them in a fit of rage. She is right, my lord, Elena said quietly from the doorway. She had been watching them, her ancient eyes filled with a new level of respect for the human woman. A direct reprisal is a trap. Then what do you suggest we do? Dante growled, the effort to restrain his fury making his voice a low threat. Allow him to burn down the city piece by piece. No, Myra said, stepping toward the holographic map of the city. Her finger traced a line through the industrial district. We hit him where it hurts. Not his soldiers. His money. For the next few days, Myra threw herself into the work, using her grief as fuel. She led the intelligence team, applying her real-world knowledge to the Volkov's network of shell corporations and money laundering operations. While Dante's people were experts at tracking supernatural assets, Myra understood the grimy mechanics of human finance. She found the vulnerabilities they had missed, the over-leveraged real estate deals, the illegal shipping containers, the corrupt city officials on their payroll. She pieced together a plan not of violence, but of surgical economic devastation. The plan was brilliant. It was silent, clean, and utterly ruinous. In a single coordinated night of electronic transfers, anonymous tips to federal agencies, and strategic leaks to the press, they dismantled Ivan Volkov's financial empire. They didn't break a single law of their own kind. They simply exposed his illegal mortal dealings to the mortal world. By sunrise, his assets were frozen, his human partners were in custody, and his entire operation was in flames, not from fire, but from legal and financial collapse. It was a masterful stroke, a checkmate delivered not with a sword, but with a keyboard. And it had been orchestrated by a human bartender. Ivan Volkov was cornered, his power base crumbling. A desperate animal is a dangerous one. He knew he had been outmaneuvered, and he knew by whom. His hatred, once focused on Dante, now centered on Myra, the human who had become the architect of his downfall. He called for a parley, a face-to-face meeting with Dante on neutral ground, at the site of the now-defunct Crimson Lounge. It was a transparently obvious trap, a final, desperate gambit. You cannot go, Marcus stated flatly in the war room. It is an assassination attempt waiting to happen. If I refuse, I show fear, Dante countered. It would weaken my position with the other clans. He's not trying to kill you, Myra said, her voice grim. Not there. He knows he can't. He's trying to get to me. She was right. The parley was a pretext. Ivan's real goal was to lure Myra out from behind the estate's walls. He would try to abduct her, to take the one piece on the board Dante could not afford to lose. Then you will remain here, Dante commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. No, Myra said, meeting his gaze without flinching. If I hide, he wins. He proves he can control our actions through threats. I'm going with you. Absolutely not, Dante roared, his control finally snapping. I will not risk you. It's not a risk if we plan for it, she shot back, her voice rising to match his. This is the endgame, Dante. He's laid a trap for me. So let's use me as the bait for our own. The sheer audacity of her proposal silenced the room. She was volunteering to be the target, to walk into the lion's den with the absolute conviction that they could turn the tables on the lion. She laid out her plan. Ivan would expect Dante to bring his strongest vampire guards. He wouldn't expect Myra's immunity to be a weapon. While his vampires were focused on Dante's honor guard, a second, hidden force would move in. But the linchpin was Myra herself. Ivan would try to use compulsion on the guards, on Dante himself, to create an opening. He wouldn't know that Myra, standing right beside them, would be completely unaffected, a clear-eyed witness who could signal the hidden forces at the precise moment of betrayal. It was a dangerous, high-stakes gamble that relied entirely on her courage and clear-headedness under unimaginable pressure. Dante hated it. Every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to lock her in the deepest room of his keep and stand guard himself. But he looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and he saw not a fragile human to be protected, but his partner. His queen. To deny her this role would be to deny the very essence of who she was. "Very well," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance and pride. "We will do it your way." The ruins of the Crimson Lounge were a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The air smelled of ash and rain. Dante and Myra arrived with a small honor guard of 4 of his most formidable vampires, including Marcus. They stood in the center of what was once the main room, surrounded by charred beams and shattered glass. Ivan Volkov emerged from the shadows opposite them, flanked by a dozen of his own hardened soldiers. He was a large, brutish vampire with a cruel smile and eyes that burned with a desperate, feral light. His gaze swept over Dante's guards and then settled on Myra, a look of triumphant malice on his face. He had his prize in his sights. "Moretti," Ivan sneered. "So good of you to come. And to bring my dear friend, the bartender. I have a financial matter I wish to discuss with her." "The only thing to be discussed, Ivan, is the terms of your surrender," Dante said, his voice a low, cold warning. Ivan laughed. "I don't think so." He took a step forward, and his eyes began to glow with a faint, malevolent energy. He was preparing to use his will, to unleash a wave of compulsion. "I think your guards will disagree." Dante and his men braced themselves, preparing to fight the mental assault. But Myra stood perfectly still, her heart hammering, her eyes fixed on Ivan. This was the moment. Ivan's power washed over them, a silent, psychic command to stand down, to allow him to take the woman. Dante's guards grunted, their bodies straining as they fought the influence. Dante himself felt the pressure, a powerful will pushing against his own ancient mind. He resisted, but it required immense concentration. And Myra felt nothing. She watched, a perfect observer, as Ivan's attention was focused entirely on Dante. She saw 2 of Ivan's guards break from the main group, beginning to circle around, their movements silent and swift, intending to grab her while Dante was psychically engaged. This was the signal. Myra lifted her left hand and brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. It was a simple, natural gesture. And it was the prearranged signal to the hidden second team. The world exploded. From the rooftops of the surrounding buildings, snipers opened fire, not with bullets, but with darts filled with a concentrated silver nitrate solution, agonizing but not fatal to vampires. From the alleyways, 24 of Dante's elite soldiers swarmed out, moving with coordinated, brutal efficiency. Ivan Volkov's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter shock. His trap had been turned back on him. He had been so focused on his mental assault, so certain of his plan, that he had been completely blind to the larger pincer movement closing in on him. His guards were overwhelmed in seconds, subdued by the silver darts and the sheer numbers of Dante's forces. Ivan, realizing he was beaten, made a last, desperate lunge, not for Dante, but for Myra. If he was going down, he would take his enemy's queen with him. He never reached her. Dante, released from the mental battle, moved with a speed that was breathtaking. He intercepted Ivan mid-lunge, his hand clamping around Ivan's wrist like a vice. "It's over, Ivan," Dante said, his voice deadly calm. Ivan stared at him, then at Myra, who stood behind Dante, her expression one of cold, victorious finality. He saw the truth in that moment. He had not been beaten by Dante Moretti's ancient power. He had been beaten by a human's mind. "How?" Ivan choked out, his face a mask of disbelief. Dante simply looked at Myra, his expression filled with an emotion that was deeper than victory. It was awe. It was love. The Volkov clan was broken, its leader captured, its power shattered. The threat that had loomed for so long was finally neutralized. As Dante's forces secured the area, he walked back to Myra, who stood amidst the quiet aftermath of the battle she had engineered. He stopped in front of her, reaching out to gently cup her face, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. She leaned into his touch, drawing strength from him. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were braver than any warrior I have ever known." He looked around at the ruins of her bar, the place where their story had begun. "I am sorry for this," he said, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. "I can have it rebuilt. It will be exactly as it was." Myra shook her head. She looked at the charred remains of her old life, and she felt not grief, but a sense of release. That life was over. A new one had begun. "No," she said softly. "Let's build something new." Dante looked at her, understanding her meaning. He wasn't just talking about a building. He was talking about a future. Their future. He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that lit up his features. "Something new," he agreed. He took her hand, his cool fingers lacing with her warm ones. "Myra Chen," he said, his voice growing serious. "You came into my life as a stranger who offered a warning. You became an advisor who offered wisdom. You have been my partner, my strategist, and my anchor. You have faced my enemies with a courage that shames my oldest soldiers. My world is stronger, safer, and better because you are in it." He went down on one knee amidst the ashes and the broken glass, a king kneeling to a bartender. He held her hand to his lips, his dark, intense eyes never leaving hers. "I am asking you to help me build that new world not just as my advisor, but as my equal. As my queen." Tears welled in Myra's eyes, hot and sudden. They were not tears of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming, impossible joy. She thought of the lonely woman she had been, polishing glasses in the dark, and the woman she was now, a king of the night kneeling at her feet. She had never wanted a crown. She had only ever wanted a partner. And she had found one in the most extraordinary man she could ever have imagined. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Dante, yes." He rose, his face illuminated with a happiness so profound it seemed to remake him, washing away the centuries of weariness and war. He slid a simple, elegant ring of dark metal onto her finger, and then he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. In the ruins of their beginning, they stood as a new entity, a king who had found his strength not in power but in partnership, and a queen whose reign began not with a birthright, but with a single, fearless act of kindness to a stranger in a bar. The night was quiet around them, the war over, the future waiting to be built. Together.